so many actions and rhetorics coming from all sides over the past few days. Do we see any change of directions in terms of policy and strategy?
Actually, we have two battlefields. One is on site, another is in the United States. That means diplomatic battlefield. Donald Trump just held a luncheon for the 15 members of UN Security Council. This is actually a very important arrangement. This is not only for lunch. I'm sure everyone knows that. This is for policy explaining to the members of the UN Security Council. And another is the deployment of SSBN submarine, and also the aircraft carrier battle group is now heading to the surrounding waters of Korean Peninsula.
So what does that mean?
Two battlefields by the United States.
Diplomatic and also military possible.
Military. So I think the DPRK also gave very strong response, including the live fire artillery drill today. And today is actually the 5th anniversary of the Army Day for DPRK. So I think the two sides both show their tough position toward each other.
Apparently, at least. Professor Lee, what about your sense? Where are all sides heading for?
The world has so grown inured to accustomed to North Korean bluster that we tend to laugh at North Korea and be dismissive of North Korean rhetorical threats. And when North Korea actually steps back, takes a step back, not having conducted a nuclear test or a ballistic missile test on its major holiday today, Army Foundation Day, we tend to think that North Korea is fearful, or that the Chinese have put enough pressure on North Korea, or that the US bellicose rhetoric has pushed North Korea to retreat. However, I think this is a tactical step back, not even a tactical retreat. The next provocation will come at a time of North Korea's own choosing, and that will be the real test of how much resolve there is in Washington and Beijing to address this growing North Korea threat.
Very interesting point. In a statement, in fact, on Friday earlier last week, the DPRK's foreign minister accused Mr. Trump, the U.S. president, of driving the region into what he called extremely dangerous phase with the deployment of an aircraft carrier. Pyongyang said it will, quote, react to a total war with an all-out war, a nuclear war with nuclear strikes of its own style. So these are kinds of repeated rhetorics of détente, in a way, coming from the DPRK. But having said that, though, Mr. Tang, what do you make of Professor Lee's statement that, in fact, all of the surrounding countries, China, South Korea, Japan, the United States as well, Russia, who used to be in the six-party talks, actually are all working around a time schedule as the DPRK pleases?
Yeah, I think this is a very specific moment for all the parties concerned. The 6 countries in this region actually show their concern to the development or the escalation of the situation or the tension in the peninsula. We should have two explanations. First, I think the DPRK leaders actually still have a dream that in the past 60 years, almost all the game played by the United States and by DPRK, DPRK has won almost all the clashes, including the taking custody of the spy vessels from the United States. And today, I think the DPRK leaders still, had such a dream to continue the story. This is one side. Another side, I think, the United States has changed a new leader. Donald Trump is very different from the previous leaders, presidents. For example, actually the United States is now facing the real direct threat from DPRK. As he mentioned during the lunch, all the threat from the DPRK is real. So if the United States faces a real threat or direct threat, I'm sure the U.S. leader will give real consideration, not only to manipulate the DPRK nuclear issue, but it will have some choices on the table to deal with the threat from DPRK.
Professor Lee, it seems that our Chinese panelist is trying to suggest as time goes on and circumstances change dramatically as a result of the nuclear issue development, actually strategies have changed, not only in Washington, but also in other capitals as situation got worsened or the development of nuclear program in DPRK continued. Professor Lee.
Well, we laughed at North Korea when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in October 2006 because the yield was so small. We're not laughing any longer. The latest test back in September last year was as big as the US bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and the next nuclear test could be perhaps 20, 30 times bigger than that. So we're taking North Korea seriously, and this belated sense of urgency that we see in Washington, D.C. is something new. Now, South Korea is a factor in this as well. As you know, we have a presidential election in South Korea in less than 2 weeks, and the front runner is an advocate of returning to South Korea's old policy of generous engagement of North Korea, dialogue, more economic cooperation, and so on. So, for North Korea to be a factor in the remaining time leading up to the election on May 9th, one would think North Korea should refrain from provoking the South, but it doesn't work that way. North Korea needs to remind the nervous South Korean public that South Korea needs to return to dialogue and engagement, or else. So I think the time is ripe for North Korea to do something, an external provocation in the form of a serious missile test or a nuclear test in the coming days. And that's when we'll see how China responds, how the US responds, how Japan responds.
This is another interesting point, which we need to put out in this discussion fairly. That is, have all sides put themselves into a corner. In other words, as rhetorics ratchet up, as military options really on the table, I mean, in the waters of the Korean Peninsula, for example, US aircraft carrier. And when China also pledged as much as it could to do to prevent anything from happening, have we all put ourselves, except the DPRK, into a corner?
Yeah, this is really a reality for all the parties concerned in this region. Actually, different countries have played very different roles in the past 15 years. For example, during the first round of a six-party talk in 2003, China was only a mediator. China established the forum for the United States and the DPRK to have a face-to-face discussion or dialogue, negotiation. And because there is a principle in the hand of the United States that the United States could not give a face-to-face or direct contact with the counterparts from DPRK. And at that time, China was really a mediator. But today, as we have witnessed in recent months, between the two leaders, I mean between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, the two leaders actually are really serious in dealing with the real and direct threat from DPRK for the sake of all the countries in this region.
All right. So while we have temporary peace for now, on the 85th anniversary of the establishment of the North Korean Army, are we going to have that in a few days from now? Professor Lee, you are certainly retrospective in pointing out the history and also all sides' interactions with DPRK. But where do you think the strategies are going from different parties? Let's just say, starting from the United States.
I think American policymakers realize that North Korea is no longer a child throwing a temper tantrum just for the sake of attention. It never was, but that's the belated realization. I think policymakers realize that North Korea, the North Korean leader, is not crazy or suicidal, so quite unlikely to nuke Washington, D.C., even though the bluster suggests otherwise. And what that means is the de facto peace, unstable and imperfect as it has been over the past 60 years, will probably remain. The status quo will continue. At the same time, North Korea does seek to change that game with its demonstration that it has the capability, backed up by intent, to marry a nuclear warhead with an intercontinental ballistic missile. So when that day comes, that will be a game changer.
Right.
No longer will kicking the can down the road, procrastination and half measures will work.
At this point, we don't know when that game changer will come, but already at this point, 6 nuclear tests will be a bomb for all the parties involved, certainly on the nuclear issue. We are also joined right now from the United States, Washington, D.C., Sharon Squassoni, the Director and Senior Fellow of the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Squassoni, welcome to our program. I know you've been working for decades on the non-proliferation issue. DPRK nuclear issue certainly one of those on your agenda. When is that game changer going to come? Some say a few years, some say probably the 6th nuclear bomb already would make all parties change their very direction of strategies.
No, thank you. I think for the United States, clearly the game changer comes when our territory can be targeted with North Korean nuclear missiles. That day isn't here yet, right? So there's some uncertainty about the range of the Musudan missiles. The longer range missiles have not been effectively tested. We're not quite sure. There's a range of uncertainty there. That's a few years into the future, but you know, with every test, whether it's a ballistic missile test or nuclear weapon test, the North Koreans learn more. So that's why I think there's some urgency added to this problem right now. I would say, however, that the Trump administration has injected more urgency than is probably good for the situation. And so that's why we're all watching this very closely.
Mrs. Squassoni, you know better than all of us that right now in Washington, D.C., a meeting is likely to be conducted between senior members of the Congress and also the Defense Secretary on the latest development in DPRK. Some say it could just be action put out by the Trump administration to alert Pyongyang that they could really be serious about this. Others say there are really some plans already on the table. As we all know, Mrs. Squassoni, earlier there was so-called a strategic plan on DPRK being drawn up and provided to the President Trump. Do you think militarily U.S. is ready?
Oh, it's so hard in Washington these days to tell fact from fiction.
That's right.
Quite honestly.
I guess anywhere in the world these days.
Right, no, exactly. But so Trump has, yes, there will be a meeting tomorrow in Washington, D.C. Mr. Trump is supposed to gather the entire Senate together. That is a very unusual thing. Most people are looking at that with a little bit of a skeptical eye. You know, the end of this week marks Mr. Trump's 100 days in office. That is often a benchmark by which all presidents are judged. You know, how well did they do? He doesn't have a lot of good things to tally up, right? His health care reform died. So I look at that particular meeting very much as a little bit of theater, a little bit of reality TV.
Okay.
That said, obviously, the U.S. military is quite professional. It has probably a range of options and plans on the table. My guess is that there's not going to be much new there in terms of what the military options are, but I would also say that we've heard a few promising things from administration officials about, no, we're going to seek, we're not going to seek military options, we're going to seek a negotiated solution. Obviously, when you listen to Vice President Pence, he then walks that back a little bit. Look, Washington is in disarray at the moment. And I don't think that any plan that we hear about this week, if we do hear about a plan, is either, very serious or very well thought out.
Very interesting.
So, what'll be interesting tomorrow is
it will be interesting to watch
their reaction.
Yes, exactly
to
what they're going to say and what they're going to say to the press after those briefings. But there are so many things going on with the different countries. Ms. Squassoni, you talk about the 100-day. Interestingly, for Mr. Trump, the U.S. president, but in South Korea, Professor Lee talked about there's an election in 2 weeks. In North Korea, of course, it has always been in the way of being provocative. That put Mr. Teng, your country, China, in a very strange position. President Xi called Mr. Trump once again this week and urged all parties to constrain and also work toward the same goal rather than work hard on very different directions. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Yeah, I'm sure there is a window of opportunity already occurred in the Korean Peninsula, and the most important thing for the United States, for China to cooperate, is that, as we discussed now, the two countries have already realized the real and the direct threat from the missile and from the nuclear capability in DPRK. And originally, actually, the United States, in the past 20 years, manipulated the nuclear issue in DPRK, sometimes just for the sake of the United States, and for the deployment of U.S. troops, and also for the consolidation of the airlines with the ROK and with Japan. But now, as Madam Squassoni just mentioned, the United States is now really facing the threat from DPRK, the missile capability and nuclear bomb. So I think this is a foundation for China and the United States to cooperate.
But Mrs. Squassoni, you talk about the, two options by the president. There's a aircraft carriers in the waters of the Korean Peninsula. There's also a lot of rhetoric of also cooperating with the Chinese side, yet the U.S. side has never said we're going to offer you with the carriers. All the other two options could be sticks. What about that agreement about the ceasefire? What about what's going to happen after the Korean War, which the North Korea has claimed has always been one of the biggest challenges for them to seek security? Ms. Squassoni, is that day going to come for the U.S. seriously consider about that, the security guarantee so-called?
Right, so there's a wide range, or
I heard a long sigh from
opposition.
you, Mrs. Squassoni. I understand what is behind that long sigh. But what Mr. Teng just said is that there is a window opportunity. Everybody, don't miss it. Window opportunity here, Mrs. Squassoni.
Right, so the question is, will we recognize that opportunity? There's a long history about whether the U.S. should conclude a peace treaty with North Korea. Some people say at this point, some experts say, yeah, we should do it. I think a lot depends on what happens with the South Korean elections, and if that new government has a more, I don't want to call it a softer policy, but a more engaging policy with North Korea and doesn't have a problem with the United States concluding that peace treaty. But the question is, ultimately, if we did that, what then? Would North Korea actually denuclearize? So there's always the question of, yes, there is a very concrete list of things that we could offer North Korea in exchange for certain actions on their part, and that's ultimately the calculation. How serious is Kim Jong-un about ratcheting back these security threats that not only threaten the United States, but also potentially China and South Korea and Japan.
We don't know, right? I mean, we don't know. That is exactly the problem, that we don't have any strategic trust, not to mention long-term trust among any of the parties we're talking about. So Professor Lee, I want to go to you finally. Are there plans, do you think, parties could take? Who is likely and who should do that first step, the very critical step?
If the new government in South Korea to take place in May returns to South Korea's old policy of generous engagement of North Korea, giving North Korea virtually unconditional, no questions asked aid, the atmospherics will change. The argument for engagement and direct negotiations will become stronger. The argument for more financial pressure and sanctions will perhaps be marginalized. So that's what North Korea is probably hoping for. With respect to a peace treaty, it sounds very nice, and North Korea has been suing for a peace treaty since the early 1970s. And the main reason that the US has not obliged is because a peace treaty between the US and North Korea will inevitably call into question the very raison d'etre of the US troops in South Korea. It will lead to the downgrading of the US-ROK alliance, perhaps US-Japan alliance. People will ask, why are US troops in South Korea when there's a peace treaty between North Korea and the United States? So once we go there, then I think the balance of power in the peninsula shifts slightly in North Korea's favor. North Korea will be able to extort South Korea with greater freedom. And, you know, historically, peace treaties and non-aggression pacts between adversarial powers have been shown to be a historical canard. There was a famous non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1938. 1 year later, there was war.